Hi, class. So I'm just going to record something really fast for you, or not really fast. It's going to take a little while, but just to review some things. So hopefully you all have gotten on to your discussion topics. You've looked at that, um, and that you've started your EDAPT. I'm going to keep hammering this as much as I can because they're very important to do. I have posted the topics here for you. So if you look at the topics here, these when I do this, I'm looking directly at the test when I make these. So these are not the exact questions, but these are the topics that you're going to have. So it would behoove you to make sure that you can go through and explain all of these in a manner that you can kind of do this from memory. So I would take these, and what I would do is I would put them in a Word document, and then I would fill them out and use that as a study guide. We're going to go through all of these today. Perfect. So let's take a look. So I'll do this every week. So make sure that you start this early. Studying a day or two before an exam is not a great way to do that. If that's the way you've done things in the past, you're probably going to have a very hard time doing that for this class. So let's go ahead and get into what we're looking at. So the first thing, here are some topics that they put on here. Explain the structural difference between the three types of muscular tissues and compare their functional properties. Examine. Hold on. Wife's calling. Okay, um, so what do we need to know in this chapter? Well, the first thing is we need to know the difference between the different types of muscle tissue. Then you should be able to draw a muscle cell and label all of the parts of a muscle cell. Then you should be able to tell me the characteristics of a muscle tissue. There are 4 characteristics. You should be able to tell me those. Then we should go over and do the hierarchy of muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is organized in such a fashion where the cells are put together in a specific way that it's going to allow it to do its function. So you should know that. Then there's going to be connective tissue coverings over each of those sections in that hierarchy. You should know all 3 of those. Then we should know when we get down into the anatomy of the sliding filament theory, you should understand the anatomy of a sarcomere. There's going to be the actual structures and the proteins that are involved. And then there's going to be like different bands and things that you're going to have to know and be able to label. So I'd be able to draw a sarcomere and label it. I'd be able to draw a muscle cell and label it. I'd be able to draw the hierarchy of structure of a muscle tissue and be able to explain it. Then I'd be able to explain sliding filament theory to somebody that knows nothing about anatomy and physiology. Then all of this is going to take energy in the form of ATP. There are 3 sources of ATP. Be able to explain where those come from and how much time that gives you as far as energy goes. Then there are different types of contraction that we have. You should know the 3 different types of contraction and be able to explain those and give an example. Then we have neurological control of the muscle to make muscle contraction happen. You should know the steps that are involved in muscle contraction. Then you should know all of the muscles that we have. You should know them. You should know the organization of muscles. That's this question right here. You should know the different types of levers that we have, and then any pathology that we have. Okay. So let's start with the different types of muscle tissue. So I would first start by making a chart. So draw a chart here. You're going to put in the first section, you're going to put the different types of muscle tissue. What are the 3 types of muscle tissue? Skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal, cardiac, smooth. Next column, where do we find it and what's its function? Skeletal muscle, where do we find it? Attached to our bones. What does it do? It helps us move, helps us set posture, generate force, open and close openings. Cardiac, where do we find that? Around the heart. What does it do? It's going to cause the heart to pump. Smooth muscle, where do we find smooth muscle? Smooth muscle we find around our organs. What kind of organs? Like our bladder, like our arteries, like our esophagus. Usually what we'll do is we'll have a student in real life. We have them, if they're into CrossFit or gymnastics or cheerleading, we can have them come and they can do a handstand. I'm waiting for a patient. They could do a handstand in front of the room, and then what we could do is we could either feed them something or give them something to drink. Now, if we feed them while they're doing a handstand, if we feed them a piece of apple, is that apple going to get from their mouth down their esophagus into their stomach if they're upside down? The answer is yes. And the reason for that is because we have smooth muscle that surrounds the tube of the esophagus and it pushes the food down to the stomach. It's not just gravity. Our astronauts can actually eat and drink in space because of this. And our whole GI system, it's going to squeeze everything down like a tube of toothpaste. And when you get to the digestive system chapter, you're going to learn all the different names for all of these things. So that's where we find smooth muscle. Okay, so that's the next one. The next one after that is, now how do we differentiate the three different muscle tissues? You have three of them. If you're looking underneath the microscope and you decided that you have skeletal or that you have muscle, how do you tell if you're looking at skeletal, cardiac, or smooth? Well, the first thing you look at is striations. So the next category is striations. So which ones are striated? That's going to be skeletal and cardiac. If it is not striated, it is smooth. Now, so how do you tell the difference between skeletal and cardiac if they are both striated? Well, the way to do that is that you look for intercalated discs. If there are intercalated discs, what are we looking at? We're looking at cardiac muscle. If there's no intercalated discs, we're looking at skeletal muscle. If there's no striations, we're looking at smooth muscle. So smooth is not the one that's striated. What are intercalated discs? Intercalated discs are gap junctions. And if you learned in your histology chapter, they pull cells together and they also allow exchange of things. In the heart, you're going to exchange electrical signals. So when one muscle cell beats, another muscle cell beats. And the reason we want this is because you want all of your ventricle cells to beat in a rhythm and you want all of your atria to beat in a rhythm. What happens if your heart beats out of rhythm? That is called an arrhythmia. So this allows all of the cells to beat at once. All right, so now the next thing is it voluntary or involuntary? Skeletal muscle is voluntary. That makes sense. You can go ahead and lift something, to pick up my coffee. It's all voluntary. Cardiac, can you tell your heart to beat? Stop your heart right now. Think about it. Stop beating. Doesn't work, right? Involuntary. Smooth muscle. Contract your bladder right now. Tell your esophagus to push food, or tell your small intestine to push food into your large intestine. Doesn't work, right? Involuntary. Then the last one is going to be nuclei. So does it have one nuclei or more than one nuclei? Skeletal muscle is multinucleated. So see this skeletal muscle cell here, this tube? It's got more than one nuclei. The rest only have one nuclei. They're all one they only have one nuclei in it. Now, the other thing that you can look at is the shape. So skeletal muscle is going to be tubular and straight. Cardiac muscle is going to be branchied, and smooth muscle is going to be spindle shaped. Now, you have that chart. That's what you study from. Memorize your chart. Anatomy and physiology is a memorization class, whether you like it or not. It is just straight up memorizing stuff. That's why most students don't like the class or they have a hard time with it, because it's time and labor intensive. Is because you can't memorize something in one day. It takes repetition and intensity. It's like going to the gym. You want your muscles to grow. You can't just go and lift like do 100 reps on something and then come home. You'd be like, look, as much as you want it to grow, that's not going to do it. You have to constantly stimulate, repetitively stimulate the muscles to get them to grow. That's the way it is with memorizing stuff. You have to constantly stimulate your brain to memorize something, to grow those pathways in there. All right, so we got first part done. The next part, this goes for every single anatomy and physiology class that we will ever have here. Always know the function of every system. Just put that right at the top. Put that right at the top of my study guide, functions of the system, draw some numbers under it. You got 1, 2, 3, 4 here. know all 1, 2, 3, 4, be able to articulate what those are. And this makes sense. Producing movements. That's what skeletal muscle does. Stabilizing, that's postural stuff. Storing and moving substances within the body. Well, you can move stuff in the body through smooth muscle. You can also generate heat. You can move blood by contracting the heart. So make sure you know those. Then make sure you know the properties of muscular tissue. There are 4 properties. So write yourself a question. What are the 4 properties of muscular tissue? Then on the back of it, write what they are and explain it. There are only 2 electrically excitable tissues in the body. There's the nervous tissue and there's the muscle tissue. Just connective tissue and epithelial tissue are not electrically excitable. We'll talk about this in a little bit. Contractility. Contractility just means the ability to shorten. Epithelial tissue doesn't, connective tissue doesn't, neurons definitely don't. So these muscles, they can shorten. We're going to see that. That's the sliding filament theory that you have in your discussion. Extensibility. What is extensibility? What does contract mean? Contract means to bring something together. You sign a contract with your company, and that brings you together. What are we doing with a muscle? What are we bringing together? We're bringing 2 bones together. So think about it. I got my biceps here, right? What does my biceps do? Attaches into my radius, right here into my forearm, and attaches up into my scapula back here. When I contract my biceps, what happens? It's pulling the radius closer to the scapula. You're moving 2 bones. You're contracting them and bringing them together. You're shortening it. This is important to say, the definition of origin and insertion. What's the definition of origin and insertion? Origin is the stationary attachment. Insertion is the attachment that's going to move. Make sure you memorize that. Now you have extensibility and elasticity. Extensibility and elasticity look very similar. Extensibility is the ability for something to stretch. Elasticity is the ability for it to bend back, to come back together. So you think of like an old pair of underwear here. You can have an old pair of underwear. You might be able to stretch them out. They're extensible, but they're not elastic. They're not going to stretch back. So make sure that you know the differences in all of these. All right, blah, blah, blah. Contractility is the ability of muscle to stretch. We know that that is not correct. What is the ability for it to stretch? That's extensibility. What is contractility? Contractility is the ability to shorten. It's false. Blah, blah, blah. We did that. Skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Which of the following muscles has striations? We know it's skeletal and cardiac. Smooth does not. The reason that a skeletal muscle is multinucleated is because it comes together with a bunch of myoblasts that fuse together. And so you get multiple nuclei in there. Now, this is something that I want you all to pay attention to. Right here, this is a muscle fiber, aka a cell. So students get very confused with muscle fiber because there's going to be some words that are very similar. There's going to be a myofibril, there's a muscle fiber, there's myofilaments. So when you see the word muscle fiber, I want you to think of that as a muscle cell. So that is a muscle cell. Equals fiber. So what does that mean? Well, a cell, you remember from chapter 3, had a nuclear membrane, right? A muscle fiber is going to look like this. It is still a cell. It just looks different. These two are exactly the same. They're just different. They have different structures to them that are going to allow them to do different things. So there's a cell membrane. There's a cell membrane over a muscle fiber. This is called the cell membrane. This is called the sarcolemma. Anytime you see the word muscle, sarco, it means muscle. Then there's a nucleus. And we know how many nuclei does a hold on, patient's texting me. So it's going to have a nuclei. So we know that a muscle cell has multiple nuclei in it. We have endoplasmic reticulum inside a regular cell, right? Well, muscle cells also have things that are called, well, they're not called endoplasmic reticulum. If it's a muscle, what's it going to be called? A sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, what did the endoplasmic reticulum do inside of a regular cell? If you don't remember, there was rough and smooth. The rough ones did what? They made proteins. The smooth ones made fats. A sarcoplasmic reticulum, SR, it's got a different job inside of a muscle cell. It's a storage place of calcium. Calcium is going to be very important in muscle contraction later. So the sarcolemma is, or the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to have calcium stored in it. That's all it's for. Calcium is very important to muscle contraction. Okay. Make sure you can say these words too. If you can't say something, you can't pronounce it, you will never remember it. So make sure that you pronounce it correctly. Sarcolemma, sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, now it's going to have mitochondria in it, obviously, because we got to make ATP. So you're going to have mitochondria in there. But what do muscle cells do? What is their function? They contract and relax. That's the only thing a muscle can do. Contract, relax, contract, relax. That's it. That's how it accomplishes all its tasks. So there needs to be an organelle in there that is going to be responsible for contracting the cell. And that is going to be right here. And that is called a myofibril. Myofibril. That's this guy. So what does the myofibril do? It's the contractile organelle of the muscle cell. So it allows, because remember, what do muscle cells do? They contract, they relax, contract, relax. How do they do that? The myofibril is going to get shorter and it's going to pull it together. So sarcolemma, cell membrane. Sarcoplasmic reticulum stores calcium. Myofibril, it's the contractile organelle that's going to shorten the muscle fiber. What is a muscle fiber? It's a cell. Same thing as these. There's also these things in here called myoglobin. Myoglobin. What does myoglobin sound like to you? Globin. Sounds like something that we have in our body that's used to carrying oxygen around and carbon dioxide. Myoglobin is going to be a storage place for oxygen inside of our muscles. It's also what gives our muscles their red color. That comes from the myoglobin being bound to oxygen. That's why red meat is red, is because of the myoglobin. It's the reason your blood is red. It's because the oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. So myoglobin we're going to find in red meat, and it's going to have oxygen, which will become important later. Okay, so make sure that you can look at a picture of a muscle cell. So let me see here. Oh, don't look at that. Muscle cell picture. I can spell. So we can see over here, you've got the sarcolemma, you've got the myofibrils. Look inside. All of these tubes in here are myofibrils. These are what is going to shorten it. You see the mitochondria that we have. Down here, you see the sarcoplasmic reticulum that's going to have the calcium stored in it. Now, you see here, you have these T tubules. These two T tubules are invaginations of the sarcolemma that are going to go deep inside there. We'll see why those are important in a minute. Okay, so make sure that you can draw and label a muscle cell and all the functions of the organelles that are in there. So take a piece of paper, flip it over, draw a muscle fiber, draw in all the parts, label them, and tell me what they do. Do that until you can do it with your eyes closed. All right, now let's talk about the hierarchy of structure of a muscle. All right. So we've learned all of the different parts of a muscle cell, right? And that is it right here. So anytime you see fiber, you're thinking muscle cell. So here's the muscle cell. This is a whole muscle. What is a whole muscle made out of? A whole muscle is made up of a bunch of skeletal muscle fibers, made up a bunch of fibers that are grouped together that are going to work together to be able to contract. Now, the thing is, when you think about this, a muscle fiber, we only want to recruit the appropriate amount of fibers to fire to make our strength appropriate. So if I go pick up the mouse, I don't need a lot of muscle fibers, aka cells, to pick this up, right? So I only need a few to fire. But if I pick up a book, hold on, I'm getting impatient. They're texting like crazy right now. If you pick up a book, you're going to need a lot more fibers. So what we do is that we have the muscle cells organized into groups. So like, I apologize, I'm not a military guy. Let's just assume that you don't want to dispatch your entire military for a small incursion. Like we only want a few muscle cells. We only want a few soldiers to go out. So we have a fascicle here that's like a group of muscles. So we have cells, we have a group of muscle cells, and we have them organized into a fascicle. So here's a fascicle, here's a group of muscles. Here's a group of, sorry, here is a muscle fiber. 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 Here is a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. So a fascicle is like a regiment or a battalion of muscle cells. I'm sorry, I don't know anything about the military. I'm very bad at that. So if somebody's cringing at what I'm saying, so that's what this is. So if we only need to employ a small amount of muscle fibers, we only need to fire like one fascicle. Now, like say there's a kid trapped underneath a car, right? We need to have superhuman strength, so we need to get all of our muscle fibers and all of our fascicles to fire all at once. So here is a fascicle. Here is a fascicle. Here is a fascicle. And all these little circles in there, those are all going to be muscle fibers. Those are going to be all muscle fibers. Yeah, those are going to be all muscle fibers. And then down here, what is this guy right here? These are called myofibrils. What are they? They're the contractile organelle of the cell. Now, what is myofibrils made out of? They're made of myofilaments. There's these proteins that they're made out of, and this is where all the magic is going to happen. And they're organized into things called sarcomeres. Okay, so I know that's about as clear as mud. So let's try to explain it a little bit better. Let's look and draw. I always like drawing. If you can draw something, you know it. If you can't draw it, well, maybe you know it, maybe you don't. Okay, so here's the bone, here's the tendon, here's the whole muscle. What are whole muscles made out of? Whole muscles are made up of fascicles, right? They're made up of battalions or regiments or whatever you want to call it. Okay. So what are the fascicles made up of? A fascicle, so you have muscles that are made of fascicles, but what makes up the fascicles? They're groups or battalions or regiments of muscle fibers. So each one of these is a muscle cell. When this fascicle is stimulated, all the muscle fibers fire. So here we go. These are all muscle cells. So what is a fascicle made up of? It's made up of muscle cells. All right, let's draw one out here. So let's pull out what is this thing that we're looking at? What is this thing called? What are whole muscles made up of? They're made of fascicles. That's these guys. What are fascicles made up of? They're made of cells. What is this guy? This guy is a fascicle. What are fascicles made up of? Muscle fibers, muscle cells. They're just like wrapped up. Okay. What are these little circles inside the fascicle? What are fascicles made up of? They're made of muscle cells. Okay, so let's pull a muscle cell out. One muscle cell. All right, so you've got muscle. You got fascicle. What's this guy? This is a muscle cell or fiber, aka fiber. Okay, we have all the organelles in there: sarcoplasmic reticulum, sarcolemma, etc., etc. But what's the organelle that it's mostly made of? Well, we've got these tubular structures that are in there and that are going to allow it to contract. What are those called? Those are the myofibrils. Myo. So that's the myofibril. And then what is the myofibril made out of? Myofilaments. And the myofilaments are organized into sarcomeres. All right. So now that we've got it all laid out, right? You've got your muscle cell right here. A group of muscle cells, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The number doesn't matter. I'm just counting it just to give you an idea. What are those called? Those are the fascicles. Okay, you have a group of fascicles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What is a group of fascicles? That is a whole muscle. What's the organelle that comes out of a cell? The myofibril. What makes up the myofibril? The myofilaments. We'll get into these in a little bit. Okay, so now there are coverings that you have that go over all of these things. So we start with, well, let's start from the bottom. So here are the myofilaments that are going to, actually, let's start from the top. So you got the whole muscle. What is the whole muscle made out of? It's made of fascicles. Okay. What are fascicles made out of? Fascicles are made out of muscle cells. Right here. A bunch of muscle cells. What are the contractile organelles that live inside your muscle cells? Myofibrils. What lives inside the myofibrils? The myofilaments. How are the myofilaments arranged? How are these proteins arranged? They are arranged in sarcomeres. So let's go the other direction. Let's go back. So here are the filaments. This is what they look like. We're going to get into that in just a second. Those are the sarcomeres. So the myofilaments are what is going to make up the myofibrils. They're the ones that are going to do, these filaments are going to do that sliding filament theory. They're going to slide past each other and they're going to shorten. When they shorten, what are they going to do? They're going to shorten the next part, which is the myofibril. The myofibril is going to shorten. Now, the myofibril, what's it going to do? It's going to pull on the cell membrane and it's going to shorten the it's going to shorten the skeletal muscle cell or the fiber. Now, when that shortens, what's it going to do? It's going to shorten the fascicle. Fascicle is going to shorten. What happens when all the fascicles shorten? The muscle itself is going to shorten, the whole muscle. Now, what does that do? You have an attachment, that's the insertion. That's going to be, say, this is the biceps, it's on the radius. And you have the origin, that's in the scapula. If all of that shortens and those filaments slide, myofibrils shorten, muscle cell shortens, fascicle shortens, whole muscle shortens, pulls the two tendons together, and you get a contraction. You should be able to go through that whole process. So what are the other things that you need to know about this? Is that there are coverings that are on here. So there is a epimysium that is covering the whole muscle. Epi means above, so that makes sense that it's on the whole muscle. Then you have the fascicle. The fascicle is going to have a covering that's called the perimysium. That's covering that part right there. Then the whole muscle, endo means, peri means around, endo means in down, inside. So this is the endomysium. Okay, and that's it. So what should we be able to do? You should be able to tell me, one, all of this, let's go back. So be able to tell me the difference between skeletal, cardiac, and smooth in the little chart. Be able to tell me the functions of muscular tissue. Be able to tell me the properties of muscular tissue. Then be able to tell me draw and label all the parts of a muscle fiber, aka a cell, and then be able to explain to me how a whole muscle is organized. Start from the smallest and go to the biggest, start from the biggest and go to the smallest. So this is something you have to practice. You're not just going to understand this. You got to draw it out. So let's start at the top. You've got a whole muscle. What's a whole muscle made out of? Made of fascicles. What are fascicles made out of? Muscle cells. What do muscle cells have in them? All the organelles, including these myofibrils. What do the myofibrils do? Myofibrils are the contractile organelle. What are they made up of? They're made of myofilaments. Myofilaments are organized into these things called sarcomeres. We're going to get into this. Here is the myofilaments organized. You have the thick and thin filaments. These are going to be laid out in the myofibril. So then we go to the myofibril. These filaments, the sliding filaments, they slide past each other. Then they're going to shorten. All the sarcomeres shorten. What shortens? The myofibril then shortens. The myofibril shortens. What's it going to do? It's going to shorten the cell. What's the covering over the cell? That is the endomysium. So it'll start pulling on that connective tissue, that endomysium. Then what's going to happen is that's going to cause all those cells are going to shorten. And then what's that going to do? That's going to cause the fascicle to shorten, pulling on what's the covering on that? The perimysium, and that's going to shorten. Then what's going to happen is that all those fascicles are going to shorten, and then you're going to pull on the covering of the epimysium or the epimysium. And what that's going to do, that's going to pull on the tendon, and then you're going to get a contraction of the muscle, and you're going to get a shortening. I think it's crazy that you can start at the molecular level of molecules of things like actin and myosin, these proteins interacting, and it can go all the way up where you can lift like 400 pounds. Like all it is molecules interacting to give you the ability to lift something heavy. Okay, so make sure that you can do all that stuff. That you can go through here and you'd be able to label epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, whole muscle, fascicle, fiber, myofibril, myofilament. So let's look at a question. What surrounds the skeletal muscle fibers? What's a muscle fiber, aka cell? We know that is the endomysium. What surrounds the whole muscle? It's above, so above epimysium. When you're studying from multiple choice questions, make sure that you can tell me what the wrong answers are and why they are wrong. That's the best way to study from them. All right, cool. We're going to stop there.